Russia is bleeding out of its own arteries, not metaphorically, literally. At this moment, along a stretch of highway, the Russian occupation authority itself has just declared too dangerous for its own freight trucks to drive on. The carcasses of military cargo vehicles are still smoking. In occupied Kherson, the man Moscow installed as governor, Vladimir Saldo, signed a decree on May 21st restricting movement on the M14 highway, the very road that connects mainland Russia to occupied Crimea. He did not sign it because of weather. He did not sign it because of maintenance. He signed it because Ukrainian drones have turned that highway into a kill corridor, and Russian logistics officers can no longer guarantee that an ammunition truck leaving Melitopol will ever arrive in Donetsk. Let that sink in for a moment. The occupier of a province is now banning his own supply convoys from using his own primary supply route inside territory he claims to control. That is not a frontline event. That is the structural admission of a logistical collapse. And it is happening at the exact moment Ukrainian forces have struck a material and technical warehouse in occupied Rovenki, 130 kilometers behind the front line, along with an ammunition depot in occupied Velika Novosilka, a command post in Novopetrikivka, 40 kilometers deep, drone command nodes in Selidov, Malinivka, and Vesele, and a Russian OSA air defense system inside occupied Donetsk city itself. This is not a story about a single ammunition depot. This is a case study in how an entire Eastern Front loses its skeleton from the inside out. What you are about to watch is not random destruction. It is the systematic, methodical, surgical dismantling of the logistical nervous system that has kept the Russian war machine breathing for almost 4 years. And what happens next changes everything, and because once an army cannot trust its own roads, it cannot trust its own war. I am going to walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Not the cable news framing, not the telegram triumphalism, the doctrine, the numbers, the pattern. And by the time we finish, you will understand not just what happened, you will understand why it was always going to happen. Pull the lens back, rewind to the beginning of 2026. In January, after a protracted, brutal 18-month campaign that consumed staggering quantities of Russian manpower and armor, Russian forces finally captured the city of Pokrovsk and its twin Myrnorad. Moscow celebrated. State television ran victory montages. Russian mill bloggers told their audiences that the Donetsk fortress belt had been broken, that the road to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk was now open, and that Ukrainian defensive capacity in Donetsk Oblast was on the verge of complete disintegration. The mainstream narrative, and the one most Western outlets parroted at the time, was that Ukraine had lost its keystone, that Russia had momentum, that the war was tilting decisively east. That framing was wrong. Not partially wrong, categorically wrong. And it was wrong because it confused a territorial capture with a strategic victory. Capturing Pokrovsk cost Russia more than the city was worth. It cost Russia an entire winter of armor, an entire spring of infantry, an entire generation of junior officers, and, most importantly, it cost Russia the logistical depth it needed to exploit the breakthrough. The assumption inside the Russian general staff was that once Pokrovsk fell, the cascade would continue. The terrain would open. The Ukrainian line would crumble. The road network would deliver Russian battalions deeper, faster, cheaper. That assumption has now collapsed. And here's the hidden variable that mainstream analysis has consistently missed. In early February 2026, Russian forces lost reliable access to Starlink connectivity across large portions of the occupied territories. The U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency confirmed this in its assessment published on May 18th. The DIA was explicit. Ukrainian territorial gains in the months that followed are directly correlated to the degradation of Russian command and control after losing that connectivity. Russian units in occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia oblasts went from a networked, real-time drone-coordinated force back to something resembling a 2022 mechanized army with radios and paper maps. And the Ukrainians, who had spent 2 years building exactly the opposite capability, were waiting. This matters enormously, because the moment Russian C-2 degraded, the entire Russian theory of the war, the theory of grinding mass, of human wave assaults backed by overwhelming artillery and drone reconnaissance, lost the one ingredient that made it work. Without networked situational awareness, Russian commanders can move troops, but they cannot coordinate them. They can fire artillery, but they cannot adjust it in real time. They can launch armored thrusts, but they cannot protect them from Ukrainian drone strikes that arrive within minutes of the columns being spotted. And it gets even more serious from here. Let me walk you through the milestone chronology, because this is where the prosecutorial case becomes unanswerable. Beginning in February 2026, Ukrainian forces conducted a precision strike on a Russian ammunition depot near the settlement of Novoekonomikne in occupied Donetsk Oblast. The detonations were extensive enough to produce visible secondary explosions for hours. That single strike removed forward artillery sustainment for several Russian regiments operating in the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka axis. In the weeks that followed, Ukrainian General Staff reporting documented strikes on ammunition storage points near Marianivka and Lisna in occupied Donetsk, additional depots in occupied Luhansk, and a logistics warehouse complex in Rovenki, the same Rovenki that was struck again just this week. Now layer in the long-range campaign. In March 2026 alone, according to figures compiled by United 24 analysts, Ukraine launched more than 7,000 deep strike drones against Russian military and industrial targets. That is not 7,000 drones across the year. That is 7,000 in a single month. In August 2024, that monthly figure was barely 1,000. In July 2025, 3,000. The curve is not linear. It is exponential, and the targets are not random. They are oil refineries, ammunition production plants, fuel storage, rail junctions, and the specific industrial infrastructure that converts Russian raw materials into Russian frontline firepower. This is the moment to understand what doctrine calls battlefield air interdiction, BAI. The theory is simple, but the execution is brutal. You do not destroy the enemy at the point of contact. You destroy the enemy's ability to arrive at the point of contact. You strangle the supply, you blind the command, you ambush the reinforcement, and you let the front line starve itself. Ukraine has now operationalized this doctrine at a scale and pace that no Western military analyst predicted 4 years ago. The Reuters Defense Desk reported on May 19th that Ukrainian mid-range strikes, the strikes operating at ranges of dozens of kilometers behind Russian lines, are dealing what one source called a double blow to Russia's war effort. They are degrading Russian air defenses, communications nodes, and forward logistics simultaneously, which means every Russian unit at the line of contact is becoming progressively more isolated, more blind, and more flammable with each passing week. The broader lesson here is that Russia built its entire 2026 campaign on the assumption that the rear would always be safe. That assumption is dead. It died in occupied Rovenki. It died in Velika Novosilka. It died on the M14 highway. And it died in Yaroslavl Oblast, more than 700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, where Ukrainian drones struck overnight on May 21st to 22nd in a precision raid that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed was targeting Russian oil infrastructure. The target was the Slavneft Yanos refinery, 15 million tons of oil processed annually, the primary refining asset of one of Russia's strategic oil companies. The morning after, traffic between Yaroslavl and Moscow itself had to be temporarily suspended. Pull the lens back again. This is no longer a battlefield story. This is a state-level industrial story. The Lukoil Nizhegorod Nefteorg Syntez refinery in Kstovo, Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, one of the largest in Russia, was forced into partial shutdown after Ukrainian strikes on May 20th. Industry sources confirmed to Reuters that the AVT-6 primary refining unit had to be closed, which means a sharp, immediate decline in the plant's petroleum product output. Multiply this across every refinery struck in 2026. Multiply it across every fuel depot, every storage farm, every rail-mounted oil shipment that Ukrainian operators have ambushed since January. What you arrive at is not a tactical inconvenience. You arrive at a measurable contraction of Russian wartime industrial throughput. The fuel that should be moving Russian tanks east is being burned instead on the tarmac of refineries Russia thought were safely far from the war. And the manpower picture is equally catastrophic. President Zelensky confirmed on May 22nd that Russian forces have suffered an average of 1,021 personnel killed, injured, and captured per day so far in 2026. Total Russian losses for the year now exceed 145,000 troops, and that figure was reported in mid-May. By the end of this month, Ukrainian drone commander Bravdy forecasted that Ukrainian drones alone, not artillery, not infantry, not missiles, drones alone, will have inflicted more than 34,000 Russian casualties in May. Drones, 1 month. one category of weapon. This is what doctrinal collapse looks like when it is happening in real time. A force that is taking more than 1,000 casualties a day is not advancing. It is being fed into a machine. And yet the Kremlin keeps feeding it. Why? This is the real question. Because the territorial map will tell you Russia is still moving forward in places. Vovchansk, the Pokrovsk salient, certain villages northwest of Hulaypol where the Russian 155th Naval Infantry Regiment and elements of the 394th Motorized Rifle Regiment have been filmed raising flags during infiltration missions. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced these flag raisings as captures. The Institute for the Study of War has been blunt about what they actually are: cognitive warfare. Russian mill bloggers and the Russian MOD are aggrandizing tactical infiltrations into strategic captures because the Kremlin needs to project momentum to a domestic audience that increasingly suspects there is no momentum to project. And here is where the prosecutorial case turns. On May 22nd, Bloomberg reported, and this is critical, that senior Kremlin officials now privately believe the war in Ukraine has reached, and I quote, a dead end. Inside the Russian elite, senior officials, people with access to the actual battlefield data, not the state television version of it, they are using the phrase dead end. They are saying it to Bloomberg sources because they cannot say it to Vladimir Putin's face. Putin, according to the same reporting, still wants to fully seize Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts by the end of 2026. He still believes the original war aims are achievable. The men around him no longer do. History will record that as one of the defining contradictions of this war. The man at the top still believes in his timetable. The men beneath him are quietly briefing Western journalists that the timetable does not exist. Pull the lens back one more time because this is the climax. This is the moment where the larger pattern becomes undeniable. For weeks, Ukrainian forces have been conducting what doctrine professionals would recognize as a textbook interdiction campaign against Russian ground lines of communication, the GLOCs, in occupied Ukraine, the M14 highway in Kherson, the H20 Mariupol-Donetsk City Highway. Geolocated footage published on May 22nd shows Ukrainian forces striking Russian trucks along the H20 in real time. A Kremlin-affiliated mill blogger, a Russian mill blogger, not a Ukrainian one, openly criticized Saldo's freight restriction decree, arguing that it would make Ukrainian targeting easier because every remaining transport vehicle moving along the highway would now be guaranteed to be carrying military cargo. That is a Russian military analyst publicly admitting that the occupation administration's own protective measures are making Russian logistics more targetable, not less. Now overlay this on the ground picture. Ukrainian forces have recently advanced northwest of Kotlin, southwest of Pokrovsk. Geolocated footage shows Ukrainian positions southeast of Kryvyi Luka, east of Slovyansk, where Russian forces were claiming control. A Kremlin-affiliated Russian source, again a Russian source, has now acknowledged that Ukrainian forces largely control Malotokmachka, southeast of Orikhiv in western Zaporizhzhia Oblast, after recent Ukrainian counterattacks. Ukrainian forces have advanced in western Rydkudub, southeast of Borova. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte stated on May 21st that Ukraine's strong defenses are now stabilizing the front line and that Ukrainian territorial gains are being recorded. Let that sequence sink in. Russia spent 15 months capturing Pokrovsk. Russia has spent the 4 months since then losing the ability to exploit that capture. The Ukrainian line did not collapse after Pokrovsk fell. The Russian theory of victory collapsed instead, and the so-called Eastern Front offensive that Moscow promised would deliver the full conquest of Donetsk and Luhansk by December, the offensive Putin reportedly still believes is on schedule, has, according to ISW's own measurement, advanced only 349.89 square kilometers in Donetsk Oblast since the start of the year. That is the entire output of the most concentrated Russian offensive campaign of the war, measured against more than 145,000 casualties and the partial destruction of multiple strategic oil refineries. That is not a campaign. That is a hemorrhage with a press release attached to it. The broader doctrinal lesson here is the one Western analysts have been slowest to absorb. Modern war is not won by who advances on the map. Modern war is won by who can sustain the force that advances. The side that can move ammunition, fuel, replacement parts, and trained personnel to the point of contact at a rate faster than the enemy can interdict them is the side that wins. Russia entered 2026 believing it had won that contest. Russia is exiting May 2026 with its occupation governor banning his own trucks from his own highway, with refineries shut down 1,000 kilometers behind the line, with senior officials in Moscow calling the war a dead end, and with Ukrainian forces advancing quietly, methodically, doctrinally, in exactly the directions Russia spent 18 months trying to break through. The first mistake was not tactical. The first mistake was psychological. Russia assumed depth meant safety. Russia assumed mass meant momentum. Russia assumed that capturing a city was the same as breaking a country. None of these assumptions survived contact with a Ukrainian military that has spent 4 years rebuilding itself around precisely the inverse doctrine, that you do not need to hold every meter of ground if you can make every meter of the enemy's rear undefendable. So what happens next? The honest forecast, and I do not hedge, is this. Russia will continue to claim territorial gains throughout the summer. Russian state media will continue to celebrate flag raisings in villages whose names most Russians cannot find on a map. The Russian Ministry of Defense will continue to issue daily bulletins describing infiltration missions as captures. But beneath that surface, the structural picture will continue to deteriorate. Ukrainian mid-range and long-range strike campaigns will continue to expand. Russian logistics will continue to constrict. Russian fuel production will continue to wobble. Russian casualty figures will continue to outpace Russian mobilization, exactly as Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky has now publicly stated. And at some point, not this month, perhaps not this year, but at some point that is now closer than it was, the contradiction between Putin's stated war aims and the Russian elite's private recognition of the dead end will become impossible to manage politically. That is the trajectory. That is the pattern. That is what the ammunition depots, the highways, the refineries, the infiltration missions, and the casualty counts all add up to when you stop reading them as isolated incidents and start reading them as a system. This is not a story about one depot. It is the case study of an army that has lost the ability to defend its own backyard, fighting a country that has learned to make the backyard the battlefield. And the lesson of this war, the lesson that will be taught in staff colleges from Carlisle to Sandhurst to Warsaw for the next 30 years, is that no amount of mass, no amount of nominal industrial depth, and no amount of theatrical map advances can save an army whose logistics cannot survive contact with a determined, networked, drone-saturated adversary. That is the verdict. The question that remains is whether the men around Vladimir Putin will move before Vladimir Putin does, or whether Russia will continue down this road until the road itself runs out. Those questions do not have simple answers, and they will not be settled this week. But every depot that detonates, every refinery that shuts down, every highway that the occupier himself declares unusable brings that reckoning closer. Stay with me on this channel as the picture continues to develop, because there is more coming, more strikes, more inflection points, more moments where the gap between Moscow's claims and Moscow's reality will widen further. If this analysis helped you see the pattern beneath the headlines, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because we are working toward a goal of bringing this level of strategic clarity to a much larger audience, and every subscriber is a direct contribution to that mission. The next update is already taking shape, and you will not want to miss what comes next. History will remember this spring as the moment Russia's Eastern Front stopped being an offensive and started being a confession. The only question left is who, inside the Kremlin, is willing to be the first to say it out loud.